BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved serial killer mystery. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in England in 1888, and whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. Back in 2022 for BlackBoxOnlineRadio, I created something called the Versus series, where I would look at two different criminals and compare and contrast the psychological elements between them. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing in this episode here. And I'm going to be talking about Jack the Ripper and a serial killer called the Burger Killer from South Africa, and his name was Cornelius Burger, who operated in the early part of the 20th century. And I want to be clear, this is not Joe Metheny, the serial killer that actually would take the remains of some of the victims and grind up their, body parts and then serve them as hamburger patties. That was a different individual, but it really goes to show you that there are some twisted people out there. And to provide an introduction to today's episode, I want to point out that I did an episode last year where I was talking about the different suspects in the Jack the Ripper case, and I gave suspect ratings, talking about the ones that I thought were strong suspects, mid-level suspects, and then weak suspects. And one thing with the list of Jack the Ripper suspects is I genuinely believe that out of the most widely discussed suspects, we might actually have Jack the Ripper in front of us. Out of the top 100 suspects that are most widely discussed, one of them could have been Jack the Ripper. And I don't say that in every true crime case, definitely not the Zodiac Killer mystery. And on Mondays I talk about the Zodiac Killer here on Black Box Online Radio, but with Jack the Ripper, I identified 4 suspects whom I thought were strong contenders to actually be the Ripper, and they were Charles Lechmere, Aaron Kosminski, Joseph Barnett, and Francis Thompson. And over the last 6 months, I had somewhat of a reversal where I pulled Francis Thompson down to the mid-level of the suspect ratings, and I moved up an individual named Jacob Levy. And I have a standalone episode about him, a suspect profile episode for Jacob Levy. I've also talked about him on some of the other Ripper Wednesday episodes. And I would like to give a shout out to Ben Davies, who provided the inspiration for today's episode, saying, Jacob Levy is a very good match for the profile of the killer, but outside of that evidence, the evidence against him is very weak. The South African serial killer Cornelius Burger might be a good model for Levy as the murderer. So we're going to see that there are a lot of similarities between Cornelius Burger and Jack the Ripper and a lot of differences. And also keep in mind the possibility of Jacob Levy being Jack the Ripper. Jacob Levy was a butcher who worked in Whitechapel at the time, and he contracted syphilis from a prostitute, and it began to affect his brain and develop schizophrenia-like symptoms. And it's possible that he launched a revenge plan against the women of Whitechapel, because almost everyone comes to the similar conclusion that the Ripper did not seek out sex workers or prostitutes or have this strong desire to go after people in that profession. The Ripper was targeting women. It was animosity toward women that led to the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. And Jack the Ripper is going to be a much more vicious serial killer than Cornelius Burger. But I also want to point out something in relation to the comment here from Ben when it states that outside of psychological profiling, the case against Jacob Levy is rather weak. Let's look at some of the other suspects that I just talked about. Charles Lechmere, Aaron Kosminski, and Joseph Barnett. Charles Lechmere has a direct connection to one of the crime scenes, the murder of Polly Nichols. He is the first person to find the body. Joseph Barnett was a friend of Mary Kelly. Some people even refer to him as an ex-boyfriend or some type of rejected lover. So he has some type of immediate connection to the Ripper case and one of the victims. And Aaron Kosminski was more or less the prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. So those three have very strong and compelling reasons for people to look at them. Jacob Levy is a suspect. Well, he is the suspect of the profiler, Pat Brown. So a lot of the statements that are made about him do indeed deal with psychological profiling. But let's also look at how and why the Ripper committed these crimes. As previously stated, at least 5 women were murdered by Jack the Ripper in 1888. And not only were they murdered, but 4 of them were mutilated And as Jack the Ripper progressed, the mutilations also progressed, and they were mutilated in a very particular way. As I was talking about recently when I appeared on Planet X Filmworks with Ross Geraci, and thank you to Ross for having me on, then I was looking at how Jack the Ripper didn't just dismember the bodies, he disemboweled the women. The Thames Torso Killer cut the bodies apart and doing things like cutting off the arms and legs, cutting out a section of the torso, hence the name Thames Torso Killer. Jack the Ripper disemboweled the women, pulling out their organs, and multiple times, Jack the Ripper took the organs of the women with him. We're talking about things like the uterus, the kidney, and of course with Mary Kelly, the heart. I would like to provide the most basic introduction as to who was Cornelius Berger, the South African serial killer who operated in the 1930s, around 1936 and 1937 in South Africa. And I also noticed that even though there are things written about him online, I did not find a good photo of Cornelius Berger. So we're going to be talking about a lot of things in terms of profiling once again. Cornelius Berger was a serial killer from South Africa who operated between 1936 and 1937. He murdered at least 5 prostitutes in Johannesburg and took their handbags as souvenirs. Already, as soon as I read that thing, I was like, this guy is not as vicious as Jack the Ripper. Think about what I just said. Taking the uterus, the kidney, the heart, the organs are actually taken away. This is a trophy killer. Somebody like Cornelius Berger, he is targeting women for a very similar reason to the theory involving Jacob Levy, because he was someone who frequently used prostitutes and sex workers, and he contracted syphilis. And then that is the motivation that he had for attacking these women. But he is just taking the handbags as trophies, which is not abnormal for serial killers to take trophies. It's just that Jack the Ripper was definitely more vicious. And now let's go on here, though. Cornelius Berger was born in the early 1900s. Although he was married, he and his wife slept in separate bedrooms and rarely spoke to each other. He was in his mid-30s by the time that he started committing the crimes. And as you see, he is somebody who is frequently using sex workers to the point where he contracts syphilis or another similar STI, but is most likely syphilis. This is another thing that I've also noticed that you experience from time to time when you're reading about serial killers, and that is that they might be married, but they don't necessarily have the exact type of sex life that they think is ideal, and they're more or less using the marriage as a cover for their own destructive and perverted behaviors. I've done 3 episodes about the serial killer Herb Baumeister from America, who was known as the I-70 Strangler, and he was more or less a bisexual who preferred men, and according to one book that was written about him, Baumeister and his wife only had sex 6 times during their entire marriage, their multi-year marriage, and it was just not a very sexual relationship that they had, because he was a homosexual who was going out and targeting men. His victims were male. But with somebody like Cornelius Berger, very clearly it appears that he was a heterosexual serial killer, frequently using prostitutes, female prostitutes, animosity toward women, and just believing that there is some type of revenge plot that needs to be created. Now, with Jack the Ripper, all of that is possible. It could entirely be possible that Jack the Ripper had this deep animosity toward women, and he wanted to get revenge on women, and that's why he was doing what he was doing. But let's go back to the intro on Cornelius Berger, and the case was referred to the head of the police department and a lieutenant who, after getting permission from higher authorities, assembled a team of detectives to watch over streetwalkers as they worked. 1 to 2 detectives were assigned to each prostitute. Every night, they observed men and women and wrote down the registration numbers of every vehicle that picked them up. The prostitutes would then make their clients agree to drop them off at the same place where they picked him up. This continued for months, until prostitute Mavis Davids went missing. Policemen were rushed to the Potchefstroom Road, where they found her bleeding but alive. Davids informed detectives that a man in a large black car had picked her up. However, she had become nervous when he drove her to Potchefstroom Road. Once he stopped his vehicle, she tried to escape, but he grabbed her by the neck and strangled her to unconsciousness. Alright, now this is something else that really is quite different between Jack the Ripper and the Berger Killer, and that is that this guy strangled his victims. He is more or less going after sex workers. He is strangling them and taking their handbags as trophies. As previously stated, Jack the Ripper disemboweled the women, an absolutely more vicious serial killer. And this brings up a very good point. This would be a challenge to a suspect like Jacob Levy as Jack the Ripper. If this guy were all about just getting revenge on women, he wouldn't even have to go through the process of disemboweling the women. And if it is true that Jack the Ripper committed the 5 murders that I've talked about, then why on earth does he have this obsession with the mutilations? Because with the 3rd crime, the murder of Liz Stride, she wasn't mutilated, and this becomes what is known as Jack the Ripper's double event. On September 30th of 1888, Liz Stride is murdered having her throat cut, and then roughly 15 minutes later, the Ripper meets up with Catherine Eddowes, and then she's the victim that is viciously mutilated and has her kidney stolen, or cut out of the body, and that is taken with the killer. And then the Goulston Street graffito is discovered on a wall. So that really goes to show that if that were the same killer, it's not even about the murders, it's about the mutilations and the disemboweling. And if this person just has some type of animosity toward women and he's mad that he contracted syphilis, well, you wouldn't have to do that. So you could just operate in the way that Cornelius Berger did, and that would be that he is targeting women, and he is just strangling them, committing the murder, taking the trophy so he can prove that he dominated them. And they believe with Cornelius Berger that he took the handbags as trophies because he wanted to use that as a way to relive the crimes, the way that, as twisted as it sounds, someone would look back at old photos or a medal or some type of statue or something, and they would actually think that it is indeed a trophy, reliving the experience. And it's absolutely disgusting, but that is how a criminal like that was thinking. So I think that this goes to show that there is something that is much more sadistic and intense about the Ripper. And the long and short story is that some people believe that Jack the Ripper actually got some type of sexual gratification from disemboweling the women. With someone like Cornelius Berger, that type of behavior just doesn't seem to be there. Investigators tracked down Cornelius Berger from his vehicle registration number that they had written down. The police waited outside his house for hours until Berger returned in the morning. As soon as he returned in his car, armed detectives arrested him without any resistance. He then led them to his room where he kept the victim's handbags there. 3 of them were definitively linked to the victims. And Cornelius Berger would ultimately be connected to 5 murders, but one of the victims, of course, survived, Mavis Davids, whom I was just talking about. And this is something, though, that is rather interesting, because Cornelius Berger is arrested, and then he goes on trial, but, I'll just read the aftermath section. The investigative work on the case also compared the Cape Town prostitute killer, where police used similar methods to try and protect the prostitutes. But that's not the big thing that I wanted to read. This is the part here. The medical examination found that Cornelius Berger was unfit to stand trial on the grounds that his illness had already affected his brain. He was instead sent to a psychiatric hospital where his illness rapidly progressed, causing him to die a short time later. Why did Jack the Ripper stop killing? Now, this is actually going to, again, move away from Jacob Levy as a Jack the Ripper suspect, but instead, this is going to be looking at just the Ripper mystery in its entirety. Why did Jack the Ripper stop killing? Could it be because he contracted a disease such as syphilis? And the reason why he's committing these murders is he's some type of sick, twisted, and demented individual, and that he's committing the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. And after the murder of Mary Kelly, his mental state is deteriorating strongly, to the point where he is not even really in control of his mental faculties. This says very clearly about Cornelius Berger. It's just that his illness was already affecting his brain, but he was sent to the psychiatric hospital where it rapidly progressed. And this goes to show that somebody like Jack the Ripper could have been dealing with similar circumstances. People ask the question all the time, why did the Ripper stop killing? It could be that he contracted syphilis, and that by the time he commits the murder of Mary Kelly, he's losing control, and that maybe Jack the Ripper's family had him confined, maybe he was sent to an institution, although people have more or less gone through the asylum records with a fine-tooth comb, and they've tried to pinpoint certain suspects. If anything, that's a strike against Aaron Kosminski as a Jack the Ripper suspect because he didn't go into the asylum until 1891. But if somebody were confined in their own home, they might not necessarily have a lot of records of that, and that more or less this person was just deteriorating very quickly and shortly passed away shortly after the murder of Mary Kelly, which I have to accept as the final Jack the Ripper crime. It's possible that the Whitechapel murders continued into 1888, December of 1888, that is, and then 1891, 1892, but I'm not convinced of that. I think that there's just a lot of speculation, and the crimes that happened after the murder of Mary Kelly, the murders of Rose Mylett, Alice Mackenzie, Frances Cole, and perhaps some others, were not committed by the same killer. So I think that this just goes to show that there is a strong possibility that Jack the Ripper had either syphilis or a very similar condition, a very similar medical condition. It's possible that he was a schizophrenic because when syphilis affects the brain, it turns into neurosyphilis, and people develop schizophrenia-like symptoms. But hearing these details, I mean, no matter whom Jack the Ripper was, even if he isn't one of the four suspects that I listed off, I think that this could show that syphilis might be very key in analyzing the Ripper's behavior. And I would like to go over to a website that I've never used before called JoanDeLahaye.com, and Joan DeLahaye has a book out called Requiem in E Sharp, which appears to be a fictional thriller, but she does have a post on her website about the serial killer Cornelius Berger, whom I've been comparing to Jack the Ripper. Today's serial killer is a blast from the past. During 1936 and 37, Cornelius Berger was a man in his mid-30s, and he killed 5 prostitutes and dumped their bodies on the road between Johannesburg and Potchefstroom. He took their handbags as souvenirs and kept them in a cupboard at his home so he could relive his crimes. Strangely enough, Cornelius was married, but he and his wife lived in separate bedrooms. No surprise there. But there really isn't, though. This guy's going out and frequently using sex workers, and he's sleeping in a separate bedroom. As I said, sometimes people are just getting married to use their partner as a facade for their own self-serving purposes, and it's the marriage isn't sexually related, but they have perversions they want to act out with other people. Somewhere along the line, he contracted a venereal disease. By the time they found out, it was too late for treatment. That's what happens when you fuck around. Yeah, that's what it says. That's what happens when you fuck around. A very angry Cornelius Berger swore revenge on prostitutes, whom he blamed for his little problem. Now, why can't serial killers take responsibility for their own STDs? And that is a challenge question that was asked on Joan's website. I mean, that is exactly what was written out. I'm reading that verbatim. I will try my best to answer that because I don't really shy away from these challenge questions, and that is that the reason why is they develop this type of victim mentality, and most likely it comes from being abused as kids when they just believe that they don't deserve the abuse that they've experienced, whether it's from their parents or maybe they've been bullied at schools. So they develop this type of victim mindset where anything bad that happens to me is because of other people, and even something such as contracting a venereal disease would be, well, that person knew that they had the venereal disease and they withheld that information from me, and that they've now given me to this. They are to blame. It takes two to tango, right? But they blame that person for either being deceptive or withholding vital information. After the 4th murder, the cop in charge of the case was Lieutenant Ulf Boberg, and he decided it was time to take more serious action, and he got a team of detectives together, and they would look after Johannesburg's prostitutes instead of arresting them. A couple of detectives were assigned to each prostitute, and as we heard in the other article, that was 2, to be precise. They would watch them all night and record the registration numbers of all the Johns, and by registration numbers we're talking about the vehicles. One night, just after midnight, Ulf Boberg waited for his detectives to check in, but one of them didn't, and when he was supposed to, Ulf was about to send out a search party when the detective finally showed up with the news that one of the prostitutes, Mavis Davids, had not come back. The detective gave Ulf the registration number of the last car that picked her up, and they decided to find Mavis before picking up and confronting the suspected killer. And as we know very clearly, what happened is that they were actually able to track down Cornelius Berger to his home and arrest him, and then he just more or less got worse and ultimately passed away. Once again, thank you to JoanDeLahaye.com for that article on Cornelius Berger, and it goes on a little bit. It's just I don't think we need to go over all of that information exactly. So are you noticing any exact elements that seem similar and different between Jack the Ripper and the Berger killer? And I think that the biggest one is that Jack the Ripper was more vicious. Jack the Ripper was more focused on mutilating and eviscerating the victims. Jack the Ripper didn't necessarily want to cause an enormous amount of pain to the victims because mostly the victims were dead when he was mutilating them, and I mean they were, because he would slash their throat, so they would be dead and they would have been strangled first too. So Jack the Ripper isn't necessarily about causing an intense amount of pain to the victims. He is disemboweling them because of some type of gratification that he is receiving. The burger killer is absolutely to the contrary. His focus is on killing the women and just committing the murders. That is his ambition. He doesn't even need to do things to their bodies. He doesn't even need to take trophies that are biological, like organs or cutting off someone's ears the way that Jack the Ripper threatened to do. He is just taking their handbags. Those things are very consistent among a revenge killer, someone who wants to dominate women. And that is a strong commonality between the two of them, between Jack the Ripper and the burger killer, is that they wanted to dominate women. They both had a psychological problem involving women. And no matter whom your Jack the Ripper suspect is, it's quite possible that he contracted syphilis or some other type of disorder, or maybe he even had a mental condition that wasn't necessarily sexual in nature, that wasn't an STI, but that caused him to behave in the way that he was behaving, and that he died shortly after the crimes ceased. After the murder of Mary Kelly, Jack the Ripper died shortly after. It's been widely discussed, and that's one of the reasons why people would veer away from a suspect like Montague John Druitt, who didn't die until 6 weeks or 5 weeks after the murder of Mary Kelly, thereabouts. It might even be a little bit more than that, because we don't know the exact date that Montague John Druitt died, but he's a Jack the Ripper suspect that committed suicide after the murder of Mary Kelly. But people are saying that the murder of Mary Kelly does not seem like they're in any right state of mind, and if Montague John Druitt was Jack the Ripper, that would have meant that he would have gone back to work for 3 weeks, and nobody would have noticed that he was just absolutely losing his mind. So I think that he is one of the weaker Jack the Ripper suspects. But also, if anything, I think that this pushes away from a suspect like Jacob Levy, whom, I'm not going to lie to you guys, I thought was quite possibly could have been Jack the Ripper. I would still put Jacob Levy up as a top-tier suspect, even though I think that maybe there are some reasons to have more doubts, because somebody who just wants revenge on women for contracting syphilis does not need to go through these types of intense mutilations or perform the intense mutilations on the victims. Now, every criminal is different. Just because Cornelius Berger didn't, it wouldn't mean that Jack the Ripper couldn't have done that. And I mean, it would just I'm just looking at this as a fact, saying, here's a case example of somebody who had syphilis and wanted revenge on prostitutes, and this is how he committed the murders, and Jack the Ripper committed the murders in a different way. So, what do you think about any of the suspects that I've discussed in this episode? Joseph Barnett, Charles Lechmere, Aaron Kosminski, Montague John Druitt, and of course Jacob Levy. And I would like to remind you guys that if you want to support this channel, you can go over to BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88, and you can use that website to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And anything that you donate will be used to purchase true crime books to talk to you guys about. And next week on the channel, I will be discussing the book Jack the Poet Was Francis Thompson Jack the Ripper by Simon Webb. And I told you that I used to think very highly of Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and then I heard some things that made me move him lower down on the list. But almost all of those observations came from an individual named Richard Patterson, who has a book out there called Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson. And I mean, I've heard Richard Patterson's take on the subject. I've listened to numerous interviews with him. And there is another book out there called Jack the Poet, which is about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And I thought that if I entertained this guy as Jack the Ripper in the past, or I thought that he was a strong suspect, I want to read someone else's perspective on this. So please look out for that episode on Ripper Wednesday coming out next week to anyone who's listening to these live. And if you're listening to this in the distant future, then feel free to check out some of the other Jack the Ripper content here on Black Box Online Radio. Every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer, and on Fridays I now do a segment about D.B. Cooper. If you're curious about these unsolved mysteries, once again, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNet88 on Instagram, and I'll see you over there. Until next time.